Magical Mystery Tour was not the success that the Beatles had hoped for and produced a hodgepodge of songs. Some of them that people still know today, like Magical Mystery Tour and I Am the Walrus, but it was not a success. It was shown ultimately on television in Great Britain, and it really showed the Beatles being a little bit exhausted. But the album start of Magical Mystery Tour was a huge success because Capitol gathered up the songs the Beatles had only released as singles previously, like Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, and put them on the album as well. So it was almost like a greatest hits album for the Beatles. In late 1967, the Beatles decided to go to India to follow the Maharishi. This was primarily influenced by George Harrison, who had done one song on Sgt. Pepper, Within You, Without You, which was heavily influenced by Indian music. The Beatles spent a lot of time there, and during the time that they were in India, though they became disillusioned with the Maharishi ultimately, they wrote most of the songs that would ultimately compose the White Album, which is actually called the Beatles, but everybody calls it the White Album because the album cover is completely white and has no illustration on it whatsoever. It ended up being a double album. It has over 30 songs on it, and it contains the Beatles really doing some very interesting experimental work. No singles were released directly from the White Album, for during that time, the Beatles continued their idea of releasing singles independently. And during early 1968, they released Lady Madonna, which was a huge hit. And then later, on their own record label, Apple, they released Hey Jude, which actually became in 1968 the most successful Beatles single of all time. It was number one for 9 weeks. The flip side of Hey Jude was Revolution, which continued the Beatles' idea of putting great songs on both sides, not the traditional throwaway B side. Anyway, getting back to the White Album, as I said, they wrote most of the songs when they were in India, including a song that's on the first side of the White Album called Dear Prudence. Dear Prudence is an interesting song. Mia Farrow accompanied the Beatles on their trip to India, and she brought her sister Prudence with them. And at some point, either spooked by drugs or the presence of the Beatles or who knows what, she refused to come out of her room one day and join the Beatles on whatever activity they were planning. And John Lennon went up to her room and sang, Dear Prudence, won't you come out and play? Obviously, ultimately flushed that out and it became a long song. There's a lot of experimental music on the White Album, including Revolution Number 9, which goes on for 8 or 9 minutes, and that's the famous song that people claim if you play backwards, you can hear sirens going and whatever. We'll get back to the whole thing about planting the idea of Paul being dead in just a moment. But the White Album, of course, also was a tremendous success, but not without a strain. During the White Album is when John Lennon met Yoko Ono, and Yoko Ono ended up sitting in on many of the sessions that the Beatles had. The other Beatles obviously resented that bitterly. Other people did sit on some of the sessions too. For example, George Harrison wrote his first truly successful song for the Beatles, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. That was a contribution to the White Album. And Eric Clapton came in and helped the recording on that. Uh, During the White Album, many of the songs were recorded by one or two of the Beatles individually, and not all the Beatles being in the studio one time. Going backwards a little bit, the first solo Beatles record is actually Yesterday. In 1965, Paul McCartney had a dream, and he woke up and scribbled it down really quickly, this music that he had heard in his mind while he was dreaming. And when he woke up the next morning, he swore he must have heard it before, that he had gotten it from somebody else. But it turned out it actually was an original inspiration. But all he had was the music to this and no words whatsoever. He called the tune originally Scrambled Eggs. Ultimately, when he put words to it, it became Yesterday, which to this day is still the most covered song, which means it was recorded by the most other artists ultimately. Yesterday, of course, was a huge success. When Yesterday was recorded, though, it was recorded only with Paul McCartney and strings, and none of the other Beatles were on the recording. So the first Beatles song, solo song, actually goes back all the way to 1965. But during the recording of the White Album, that process really began in earnest, that the Beatles working on their own songs, not necessarily even respecting the other people's work. When Ringo Starr walked out of the recording sessions for the White Album, the other Beatles courted him back, sent roses to him actually, praised him for being a fantastic drummer. obviously, ultimately, the recording was done. But damage was already done to the Beatles. And coming off of the White Album, what they decided to do to try to get back together and capture the spontaneity that they used to have, they decided to do a live recording of their time in the studio and make it into a movie, which would ultimately be Let It Be. The recording sessions for this went very poorly, though, even though some tremendous songs were recorded during that time, like Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road, Get Back. Nothing ever really came of it. There was so much argument between the Beatles and so forth that the project was ultimately put aside and left on the shelf for a while. But the last time the Beatles actually performed in concert, so to speak, was during the recording for Let It Be. They went up on the rooftop of their studios and recorded Get Back spontaneously. And people in the streets saw the Beatles singing on the top of the roof. And uh, accompanying the Beatles on Get Back, by the way, was Billy Preston, who for a while was regarded as the fifth Beatle. So that's an interesting bit of trivia. Uh, anyway, the Beatles put these recordings on the shelf and decided to have one more try at going out on a high note. And that became the recording sessions for Abbey Road, which many people believe is their finest work. When they recorded Abbey Road, that was when George Harrison really came of age as a songwriter. George Harrison contributed two tremendous songs to the Abbey Road album, which was Something and also Here Comes the Sun. Something is an interesting song because the title to it was inspired by James Taylor, who had been recently signed to the Beatles label Apple Records. Apple Records was an idea that the Beatles had so that they could give artists freedom and perhaps have freedom themselves without having to answer to another record label. The first recording on Apple Records had been Hey Jude, which was the Beatles' phenomenal success. The second released on Apple Records was a recording by a young lady named Mary Hopkins. It was produced by Paul McCartney, and that was Those Were the Days, which was an old British bar tune, but it became a phenomenal hit around the world. In fact, it reached number two and was number two for a number of weeks, ironically, only kept out of the top spot by the Beatles' own recording of Hey Jude. But James Taylor was another artist who was recruited by Apple Records. And when he was recruited by them, one of the songs he recorded was something in the way, whatever it is, but there was something in the title. And George Harrison picked up on that and did a tremendous recording. By the way, the song Something was recorded for George Harrison's then wife, Patty Boyd Harrison. And she is the only person that I know of who had two phenomenal successes, both recorded and with her as the inspiration. Because later she left George Harrison for Eric Clapton, his best friend, and Eric Clapton recorded the song Layla as a tribute to her. So that's really something. The first single released off of Abbey Road was a double A side again, as the Beatles wanted to do, which was Come Together on one side, and on the other side was the song Something. Uh, Come Together is an interesting song because Come Together has a verse in it that John Lennon meant to refer to each Beatle individually. There are four verses in it, and one of them refers to Ringo, one of them refers to John himself, one refers to George, and one refers to Paul. The Abbey Road album cover also capsulizes the idea of Paul being dead. That rumor had gone on for a while. It was a self-planted joke from the Beatles. And since I can't show you visually now, I'll go over it just briefly. But if you look at the back side of the Abbey Road album cover, there's a Beetle, a Volkswagen Beetle, on the back. And the license plate says LMW, and it says 28 if. And it's Linda, my wife, 28 if Paul McCartney theoretically lived. That shows the four Beatles walking on the back of the album cover. Paul is out of step, and the other Beatles are dressed as an undertaker, priest, and so forth. It also shows the car barreling down, theoretically hitting Paul if it continued. And the front of the album cover has bullet holes that make the number three. This was not the first references that the Beatles had to the idea of Paul being dead. On the front of the Magical Mystery Tour album, there are four walruses, the Beatles dressed as four walruses. Three of them are in white and one wearing black. And John Lennon sings famously on another song, I'll Give You a Clue, the walrus was Paul. So there were all these references, and it was great fun. Later, when the Beatles separated and did their individual work, John Lennon on his famous Imagine album had a song, How Do You Sleep, which was really a vicious outtake to Paul McCartney. And one of the lines he had in there was, All you were was yesterday, and now you are, and all you are today is nothing. And it also has a line, You should have stayed dead. So it was obviously planned by the Beatles, but there were all sorts of things about Paul being dead, and it was meant to be good fun. Abbey Road was the last album that the Beatles recorded together, but was not the last album that was released. Ultimately, a year later, actually, ironically, on the very same day that Paul McCartney ended up releasing his first solo album, the album Let It Be was finally released. It was not done by George Martin, the Beatles' longtime producer, but was handed over to Phil Spector, and he added strings to it and did more of a wall of sound type of thing. The Long and Winding Road actually won a Grammy for Best Song in 1970, but Paul McCartney supposedly hated the recording of The Long and Winding Road because Phil Spector added strings to it and really changed it. Many, many years later, the Beatles re-released the album Let It Be without the Phil Spector touches, and it's called Let It Be Naked if anybody's interested in listening to that. So the Beatles were dissolved, and their last official studio recording was the Abbey Road album, but their last official release was the Let It Be album. At the time that Abbey Road was released, though, the Beatles were still negotiating the concept of doing one more album. And the concept that John Lennon and George Harrison came up with for that was that each Beatle would get 4 songs on the new album. There would be more of a democracy, and Ringo would get 2, recognizing his weaknesses. Even though Ringo Starr did contribute Octopus Garden, which is a popular tune, to the Abbey Road album. In general, Ringo Starr had written many, many fewer songs during the time the Beatles were together. Paul McCartney actually rejected this concept because he did not feel that George Harrison deserved an equal number of songs to Paul McCartney and John Lennon. There were other issues tearing the Beatles apart. There was the presence of Yoko Ono and her involvement in John Lennon's life. There was John Lennon's heavy involvement in taking drugs, particularly heroin. But more than anything else, it was Apple Records and their formation of this business that led to them being apart. They were not businessmen, and Paul McCartney, who had by that time had married Linda Eastman, wanted his new father-in-law to manage their affairs and run Apple Records. And the other Beatles resented this. They felt the control was being taken away from them. So the Beatles, ironically, with their last official single being The Long and Winding Road, sailed off into the sunset into some brilliant solo careers. And to varying degrees, they did have brilliant solo careers. George Harrison released a 3 set LP on his own called All Things Must Pass. And he had some tremendous hits with it and real success. And I think felt vindicated because while he was with the Beatles, he had only had a couple of tunes on each of their albums. Ringo Starr actually had the most commercial single success during the first 4 or 5 years of the Beatles' solo careers, with songs like You're 16, Photograph, No No Song, Only You. Tremendous, and actually, an album that Ringo Starr released in 1974 was the closest thing there ever was to a true Beatles reunion. His self-titled Ringo album actually had songs on it written with George Harrison, written with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, albeit all of them performing independently of each other. Uh, jo- John Lennon had quite a bit of success too, not quite to the degree that Paul McCartney had. And of course, the song Imagine is a classic. But in 1975, John Lennon actually retired from recording for quite a bit. And it wasn't until 1980 that he went back into the studio and recorded, along with his wife Yoko Ono, an album called Double Fantasy. 14 songs, 7 songs by John Lennon, 7 songs by Yoko Ono, alternately dispersed. Before that album was released, unfortunately, in early December of 1980, John Lennon was shot in New York City. The album was released to great success, and he had a posthumous #1 single, richly deserved. Uh, Rumor has it that Paul McCartney and John Lennon had found some peace with each other by the end of the 1970s, but they were very much estranged and at each other's throats during most of that period of time. Paul McCartney ultimately had the greatest success as a Beatles solo act. He was the second most prolific singles act of the 1970s on the American charts. He continued into the 1980s. I think personally that his album Band on the Run is one of his most classic works and, just a tremendous album. But I think none of the Beatles separately were as good as, of course, if the Beatles were together. They were there at a moment in time. They changed with the music of the time. They ushered in a new era of American music. And I think for so many of us, they are the soundtrack of our lives. We are going to do more conversations about other subjects coming soon. I hope you look for them. While we can't be out and about, hopefully we can share some memories and conversations together. Again, thank you to Noel Larson and to Woodlake, and I will see you soon. Thank you for listening.